All right. Good morning, sunshines. You had a pretty good Easter weekend. Uh, Back ready to go for another round of education this week. Somebody jump on the live chat. Tell me the audio and the video are okay, and we will wait for a few other folks that may be lingering to log on this morning. Things are running a little slow around town here as well, and then we'll get started. Kind of take up a little bit of a new topic here this morning. For a little bit, we're sounding scratchy this morning, but I can be heard. Is everybody hearing me sounding scratchy? Hopefully it'll clear up here in a little bit. The internet may be a little groggy today too, for all I know. I know the first, went back and listened to the first lecture recording, or it was the second one. I can't remember which one it was now that we were having all the audio issues, and it was pretty annoying. We'll find our way through it. A few more coming to life, rolling out of bed. It looks like a little scratchy, but you can hear me. Is that correct? Through the scratch. Make sure my equipment is all good to go. Okay, as long as you can hear me, we'll be okay. I sent an email out this morning that has a PDF on it of the information that we want to go over today, and probably some on. I don't think we'll get through it all today, maybe, but today and Wednesday. Then what I will do, be sure that you check your email. I will be sending out the last homework assignment probably this morning after lecture, and so it's going to be another rhetorical presses over a video, or on a video, a short video. It's not very long, and I will be sending that link out to you after class this morning, so you can get to work on that. And it will be due this Friday. I want it this Friday, and which is the 17th. 17th. So Friday the 17th this week. It won't take you very long to look at the video. What we're going to look at today, or what we're going to talk about today in the lecture period, is some very, very similar information coming from a little different perspective, that'll give you some background that you will need in order to understand the video a little bit better. So pay attention to your email as always. That's where the homework comes. And so if you're not looking at your email every day on homework and other assignments, if you're not looking at your email every day to check it, you're going to miss something. And so I know some of that's been going on. So be sure you take a look at your email on a regular basis. So, okay, we got a few folks signed in now. We're going to go ahead and take a look at this information this morning it's on invasive annual grasses. And invasive annual grasses are something that everyone in the Intermountain West has to be concerned with. And it touches everybody. During fire season in the western United States, human beings have issues with smoke and all the particulate matter that goes in the air. It's not always just smoke. Sometimes and often it's soil particles that get into the air as well during the fire and even after the fire. And so we all have sort of respiratory issues that we have to be concerned with in the Intermountain West here. So it touches everybody. It even touches veterinarians. Some of you may have seen some animals come in and they have issues with smoke inhalation. In Nevada, during fire season, certainly in California, Northern California, a couple of years ago, when we had big fires over there, we had lots of animals that had to deal with smoke inhalation and other direct effects from the fires. And so this is something that touches everybody. Invasive annual grasses touch everybody from a fire aspect because they are creating and they are changing the fuel loads and the amount of particulate matter that is in the air now that wasn't in the air a generation ago. And maybe even we could probably even trace it back to early in your own childhoods. Things have changed since then, and we need to at least have a cursory or basic understanding of why this has happened and how we can mitigate it. And so we're going to talk about invasive annual grasses this morning and their management. And we're going to talk specifically about cheatgrass, because cheatgrass is it's the dominant one across the landscape. We have a couple more that are beginning to make some inroads in some areas, a couple more species that are beginning to make some inroads into some areas in the Intermountain West. But right now, cheatgrass, this is the one that you see on the 6 o'clock news if you watch the 6 o'clock news, or that ends up a headline in a newspaper or on blogs or on the internet news services. And about 9 times out of 10, it's been my experience that those headlines and information on cheatgrass are completely bogus. They don't bother to check with the experts to see what's going on, and so you end up with a lot of misinformation that's being passed along by even the mainstream media outlets, both in print media and electronic media. So we're going to take a look at it. We're going to try and get the real story to you, so you have a basic, at least a very basic understanding of why it's the way it is and how we got here and how we can get out of it. So we're going to talk about that, and we'll see how far we get along on Wednesday. I'm hoping on Friday we're going to talk about some diagnosis, some veterinary animal health diagnosis, some basic understanding of that and how to go about doing that, particularly when it comes to things like poisonous plants. So, but for today we're going to talk today and Wednesday at least we're going to talk about invasive annual grass, cheatgrass. So, pull up, if you haven't yet already, pull up that PDF that I sent you this morning via email, and we're going to take a look at it. And the title of it here is The Ecological Costs of the Status Quo. And so the first thing that we're going to define, and we're going to try and understand, is that there are ecological costs to lots of management issues. We've looked at ecological costs of allowing the wild horse and burro populations to explode on the landscape in some states like Nevada. There's an ecological cost to that. And sometimes ecological costs take a very, very long time to mitigate, if we can mitigate them at all. So there are ecological costs associated with this annual grass that we have in the Intermountain West, annual grass, cheatgrass. But it's not just the cheatgrass per se. It's kind of like the horses. It's not all the horses' fault that we've got where we are here today. And it's not cheatgrass's fault that we've got here today. It's the management that we've imposed on these things that have caused them to do things that are undesirable. And so the ecological cost of the status quo, and what I mean by status quo is the status quo, or management status quo, I should say. Is it still scratchy? Is it clearing up a little bit at all? Hopefully it's clearing up a little bit. So the next slide, what we're going to try to do in the next few slides is sort of define what the status quo is, or what it, What does the status quo entail? What does it look like? What does it include? And so we'll do that for the next few slides here. In the first one, here's a picture of some sage chickens from a project that I was involved with from a few years ago, where we actually went out. We collared sage grouse, and we went out and actually caught the same sage grouse again over a cycle of seasons. And nobody has done that before or since. It's a pretty hard thing to do, but this is a sage grouse. This is what sage grouse looks like. This is what the big deal has been in the news over the last 15 years, and I could argue 20 years or more quite easily. But sage grouse, and this is just sort of an example of what I would call the Critter of the Month Club. We used to have a situation where all you had to do was buy a stamp and send in a letter, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to investigate whether or not a species should go on the endangered species list. It's a little more involved than that now. That's how it used to work. And so we do have environmental groups, I should say so-called environmental groups out there, whose business model is built on litigation, and so they're always eager to provide a new candidate as an endangered or threatened species. And so we end up with this sort of Critter of the Month Club sort of approach to management. That's the way I've identified it for some time now. And some of them are very legitimate, and some of them are less legitimate. Some of the proposals for the claims for different species are legitimate, some are less legitimate. And certainly sage grouse was a legitimate one to take a look at the time. And so this is just a picture of that critter. But there's some other things that are sort of go together to make up our management status quo in the Intermountain West. The second slide number 2, asks that question: what is the status quo in the Intermountain West? Well, along with endangered species and their sort of and the sort of the societal move over the last 20 years to do single species management, we also have this issue of the presence of cheatgrass, or Bromus tectorum is a Latin name for it, on our perennial grass ranges. Now, annual grasses are grasses that only live 1 year. They're an annual plant, just like any annual flowering plant. They only live 1 year. They're not perennial. They have to produce enough seed in order to perpetuate themselves. Then we have perennial grasses that are long-lived. Some are longer-lived than others that aren't annual in nature. And so we have this situation where we have the presence of this annual grass, cheatgrass, in our perennial grass ranges. 100 years ago, there was no cheatgrass. 100 and change, maybe 120 years now. I forget, we're 20 years into this century sometimes. But 120 years ago, there wasn't any cheatgrass in the Intermountain West. It wasn't here. It hadn't reached here yet. And it got to the Intermountain West by a lot of different ways that we don't want to get into right now. But it's here, and it is entrenched. Boy, is it entrenched throughout the Intermountain West. And we also have, along with that being part of the status quo, is the use of perennial grass grazing systems on ranges where cheatgrass is entrenched. So we haven't gone over grazing systems. This semester has not lent itself to that very well. But suffice it to say, there are 2 grazing systems. I mean, we'll see these names again here in just a minute. There are 2 grazing systems that are most commonly used in the Intermountain West. And remember remember our timing, duration, and intensity. Well, grazing rotation systems are designed to feature all 3 of those in the management of grazing. So we've got grazing systems that we turn out at a certain time, we clean our pastures at a certain time, we put a certain number of animals out there, and we turn them out at a specific time, and so there's a specific period of time that they're out there. And we also try to increase distribution of animals across the landscape by using rotation systems. And we'll see these two names crop up in just a minute. There are two of them that are most commonly used in the Intermountain West, and they were designed to optimize the physiological needs of perennial grasses. So one of them was invented in the early 1900s, and the other was invented in the 1950s, before cheatgrass really got a foothold and became a dominant species on the landscape. So they're designed for perennial grass ranges. They're not designed, these two grazing systems that are most common were not designed, they did not have the inclusion or take under consideration the inclusion of an annual grass whenever they were put together and whenever they were studied and formalized. So we have those two things: the presence of cheatgrass. We have the use of perennial grass grazing systems on ranges where cheatgrass is entrenched. We have AUM reductions. We know what an AUM now. AUMs have decreased tremendously since the Tailored Grazing Act, and there was one other plateau in the 1980s and early 1990s where we dropped a significant amount of AUMs, and the status quo, of course, has included more fire, more frequent fire in some cases, and certainly the extent of fires has really grown over the last few years. And which brings us to the next slide here, if you'll move to it, slide number 4. This is just a graph of the wildland fires between 1980 and 2012, just to give you an idea. And what you see over here on the left-hand side, the blue bars, blue vertical bars, are, if they're blue on your screen, they show the number of fires. And so if you look at that from between 1980 to 2012, you see a marked decrease in the number of fires across the Intermountain West. Now, this is across the Intermountain West. Granted, there are areas now that fire has become more frequent, but overall, this is what we're seeing. Now, on the right-hand side, you see the green line there is the acres burned, and so quite obviously, you see that as we move from 1980 to 2012, we see that the acres per fire has increased tremendously during that amount of time. And so this just kind of gives you an idea of what has been going on with wildland fires. And as we move from 2012 till now, the extent has really increased once again, even more so. And the number of fires has probably begun to increase as well. NISC hasn't quite gotten everything put together to present that yet. So, but this is just to give you an idea of of what's going on out there as part of the status quo. Now let's look at this next slide, slide number 5. Just look at some historic patterns that I have a generalized graph of. This is just a generalized graph. And we see from about 1900 to 2000, we see a drastic decrease in the number of head of livestock. And you can also, measure that in terms of AUMs as well if you wanted to. But our livestock numbers have really gone down over that period of time. And the green line here, we see cheatgrass and other annual grasses has begun to go up since about 1970 anyway. The mid-60s was the first real cheatgrass-driven fire that we had in the Intermountain West, 1964, I believe, and it was over in Elko County. But you see that the cheatgrass and other annual grass presence, dominance, any way you want to measure it, has increased since about the 1960s, early 1970s. We see human development increasing. Oh my goodness gracious. I've been in Reno since 1999. We moved here. 20 years ago, and I think there's another 175,000 more people here now than there was when I moved here. That is incredible. Boise has experienced the same kind of growth. Salt Lake City, Ogden, Provo in Utah has experienced that same kind of growth. Elko even has experienced a significant amount of growth, and all the activity over at Spring Creek that wasn't there 20 years ago. So a lot of our sort of urbanized areas around the Intermountain West, population has just gone up. And when you have more human development, you have more ranchettes, you have more real estate that's being covered by asphalt and concrete, you have more people. If you have more people, there's a certain percentage of the population that are lacking in common sense, and some of them there's a percentage of more pyromaniacs, and so you have more opportunities for fires to start through anthropic means of all kinds, not just intentionally set. And so human development has gone up, and that's really changed a lot of things, particularly around what we call wild land to urban interface areas. And so that's a big deal. That has changed over time. And then we have this bottom line down here that I've got named as longer, hotter, drier summers. We talked about this earlier in the year. The little ice age ended about 1850. If that was a below average temperature period that lasted about 300 years, and it's over, what would you expect? You would expect it to warm up. And so we've seen a gradual warm up over the last 100 years or so from the Little Ice Age. It's possible that there may be some kind of human effect involved in that. It's hard to pinpoint whether that's true or not. It's very hard to understand what causes clouds, what causes high pressure systems that drive our weather here in the Intermountain West. It's hard to predict what causes a high pressure system to set up off the coast of California, a couple of 100 miles lower or farther south than it does normally, to create some of these warmer, droughtier sort of periods of time. We also have the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is about a 10-year oscillation, well, 20 years total. Oscillation from a positive phase to a negative phase. It's very predictable, that guides our precipitation patterns and our temperature patterns as well. But this is what's been going on for whatever reasons. And so to give you a background sort of that status quo, where have we been? So let's take a look at slide number 6 here, and let's just talk quickly about grazing systems. Typically, this is permit administration. It's these grazing systems are part of the permit system for domestic livestock on our public lands. And the two types of grazing systems that are typically used in the Intermountain West, one is called a deferred rotation. First one called deferred rotation. And the deferred rotation was invented in 1912, believe it or not, by A.W. Sampson, one of the first rangeland pioneers. And of course, you might recall that the science of ecology began with rangeland ecology. And so we've been practicing ecological management for quite some time now. But a deferred rotation, what it does is, you remember back before the Taylor Grazing Act, we had areas where animals just grazed year long. There was no movement. It was all who got there first got the forage. There was no concept of plant physiology. It was a brand new science sort of at the time. In fact, it really didn't come into its own until the 1940s when we discovered plant hormones. and invented 2,4-D and things like that. But so what A.W. Sampson said was holy cats, man, some of this stuff, some of these grass ranges just need to have a little bit of a rest. They haven't even produced seed. They've been eaten off so quickly that they've not been able to reproduce by seed maybe for a couple of decades, possibly in some areas. So what A.W. Sampson said was, look, let's just do this. Let's just have two areas and let's graze on one area, and then when it gets to be spring the next year, let's not graze on the other area until after these perennial plants produce some seed and have seed drop. So let's just defer the grazing on that other area until these plants can reproduce by seed a little bit. And so you're just deferring, once again, the timing of when animals are going to be out there grazing the perennial grass resource. Okay? Just that simple. Just requires two areas. And there may be some other physiological stage of a plant that you might want to defer grazing against as well. But in the main, for our perennial grass ranges in the Intermountain West, this was the idea. It's just give them a rest for a while in the spring so that they can reproduce by seed. They can produce some seed and maybe reseed themselves a little bit. The second one here, rest rotations, was developed in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And rest rotation, what it does is it says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to divide an area up into 3, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 pastures. Usually 3 to 4 pastures is more common. And we're just going to graze in one of those pastures or 2 of those pastures for a given year, and we're going to give the other pasture, the odd pasture, a whole year of rest. We're just not going to graze there at all. And then next year we'll go back in and we'll use that pasture and we'll graze in that pasture and we'll rest another pasture. So if you've got three pastures, then over a cycle of 3 years, you will each one of those pastures would have gotten an entire year of rest from grazing. So very simple procedure. Sometimes what you'll see is a combination of the two, both rest rotation and a deferred component in there as well. But they're tied primarily. These grazing systems are tied primarily to turnout and cleanup dates. Once again, permit administration, timing, duration, intensity, and the resource is managed as though it is a perennial grassland. These systems were developed and imposed decades ago in the federal sort of procedures, that's the CFRs, as though these areas that are being grazed were still perennial grasslands. Well, over the last 3 decades, certainly the last 3 decades, this has changed. They are no longer, and this is the biggie, they are no longer perennial grasslands. They are mixed annual perennial grasslands. The annual component has gotten so competitive and so dominant that we can really just no longer call these what were perennial grasslands. They are a mixed annual perennial grassland now, and the sooner that we understand that and come to grips with it, the better off we will be, and the better our management will be, which we will get into here shortly. So I want to talk real quick. I've used this example all over the Intermountain West. Now I've talked about this. Basically, what you guys are listening to this morning has reached somewhere around 10 billion people in one way or another. Big help with that is National Geographic. But a lot of people have heard this message now, and it's beginning to sort of trickle its way into federal policy, which is fantastic. at least at this point. But I've used this example on numerous occasions for people in Congress and otherwise to try and get you to understand more fully the concept of what we're talking about here. Surgery. Surgery is a great thing. When we really started understanding the human body, or even animal bodies, to perform surgery on animals, once we started getting an idea of the function of organs and where they're located and what we can do through the surgery process, we have done a lot of wonderful things. Surgery is a great thing. If surgery is applied, now let's take our timing and our duration and our intensity example of grazing. Surgery applied at the right time, the right duration, and at the right intensity is a wonderful thing. And it's just great. But surgery applied at the wrong time, at the wrong duration, and the wrong intensity is not so good. I break a lot. I've broken a lot of things through the years, and so I've had some surgeries, and I just had one another knee surgery last fall to get one of them cleaned up, and if you've ever had surgery on a limb of some kind, I mark which leg it is. I don't let the nurse do it. I mark which knee it is, or which ankle it is, or which shoulder it is. I'm responsible for that. Because if you go in to have surgery on your right knee and they work on your left knee, that's not good. It's not going to work out for you. If you go in to have your spleen removed because you have a ruptured spleen and for some reason or other they take out a kidney, that's not going to be very good. It's not going to work for you. But and examples of that happen. Now, I worked at a hospital in maintenance when I was an undergraduate years ago, and I would come in on the weekends sometimes to do some other things in other departments and whatnot. We had a doctor that sewed a hemostat in a heart patient, just left it in there. So things can happen during surgery that aren't so good, but no one, and I repeat, no one is going to walk into the halls of Congress and say, because we have some issues with surgery, we've got to stop surgerizing people. We got to stop performing surgery all over the United States because one mistake was made, or two mistakes, or however many mistakes that were made in a year were made. No one is going to suggest that we stop allowing the practice of surgery. And yet, when it comes to grazing, we have any number of individuals across the country for any number of reasons that are happy and willing to say we have to stop grazing everywhere, not just on public lands, but on private lands. We have people and organizations and 501(c) corporations that their business model is developed on these kinds of efforts. Now, grazing, if it's applied at the right timing, the right time, duration, and intensity, can be a fantastic tool when it comes to land management. And if it's not applied at the right time, duration, and intensity, it can be a problem. But just throwing it out the window and not allowing it is going to be problematic, and it's going to create some issues on the landscape. And it has created some issues on the landscape that are unacceptable issues as far as society goes, which we're going to work our way into it at this point in time. So just kind of keep those things in the back of your mind as we move through here. Your next slide there It should be a slide. Now, slide number 8 is some cheatgrass rangelands that looks as though it could be Winnemucca anywhere in northern Nevada, but it's not. This is in Turkmenistan, and this is a foothills grazing area. It's a seasonal range. It's a foothills area. In fact, over the hills right there, there's a little mountain range that you can't see because of the angle here of the camera, but that's Iran. If you don't know where Turkmenistan is, that's Iran. You're looking due south here over the Kopet Dagh mountain range. And I first started going over to Turkmenistan in the sort of the early 2000s to kind of get an idea of cheatgrass in Central Asia, because Central Asia basically is the ancestral home of cheatgrass. And so what's going on over there is the question in my mind. So we look at this area here, and this is taken in September. It looks like almost any place you can see that there's been fires in northern Nevada. It's a very similar climate, very similar ecological sites, and this is a mixed cheatgrass bluegrass range, foothills range, and it's grazed twice a year. It's grazed in the fall, in the summer, or in the spring, as the sheep and goats and cattle are moved up into the Kopet Dagh Mountains where they summer, and then when winter comes along, they move back down the Kopet Dagh Mountains, back through these foothills ranges, and back out into the Karagum Desert where they winter. And so these areas get grazed twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. Now, if you look at this picture, I can ask the question, well, what do you not see in this picture? And of course the answer is, I don't see a lot of standing dead biomass. I don't see a lot of forage. There's not a lot of standing dead forage there at all. And indeed that's true, because when the animals move back through in the fall, they clean this area up. And so what you're looking at here is what it looks like after the animals have already come through. This is in late September, and they're already on their way back out to the Karagum Desert. Okay, so not a lot of forage left standing up. Well, what does it look like at the same time of the year in the United States on the same kind of a range, the same cheatgrass bluegrass rangeland? The same analogy, almost the same species. This is what it looks like in Nevada during that same period of time. So what do you see? I see a lot of fire. All right, yeah. You see a lot of standing dead biomass, a lot of standing forage is what you see. So, what's the difference? The difference is in management. It's a different management approach. Because in the United States, what do? We turn animals out in the spring. Basically, we call it our late spring, early summer habitat, seasonal habitat. Typically, we'll turn cattle out, April the 1st, give or take a couple of weeks, and they will be off their federal permit by mid-July in most cases, almost all the cases. So it's a seasonal range. Some of them are a little bit longer than that. Sometimes there'll be a 4 or 5 month seasonal range. It just depends on whether you're in Wyoming or whether you're in northern Nevada or central Nevada or up on the Snake River Plain. It kind of varies a little bit, but we only turn animals out one time. We turn them out, we graze it, we get them off. We don't come back out there until next year. And we also have rotational systems that allow rest for an entire year. So what does that do? All of that leads to fuels buildup. It leads to a fuels buildup. And so we're going to see here, as we see some more pictures, we're going to take a look at what that fuels buildup can mean. Okay. Okay, so I've got a question here. A typical assumption is that they need protein supplement for dormant season cheatgrass grazing. What do they do for protein in Turkmenistan? They do nothing. They don't know what protein supplement is. And there is an old, to use an old cliche, there's a wives' tale about cheatgrass, that it doesn't have any nutritional value whenever it turns and drops seed. That's completely false. I have seen cheatgrass. Basically what it does is it mirrors our perennial grasses in terms of protein content during the dormant season. And so I have seen it in years be 3.5% crude protein, and I have seen it be as much as 8.5% crude protein on the same area, just over different years. So we don't need as much protein supplement as you would think, as the old wives' tale tells us. It's much more nutritious when it's dormant than its reputation is. And if we're careful about grazing animals and we align our production, the timing of our production schedule, then what we have in the fall in the United States, at least in our area, is a perfect sort of scenario where if we go back out, for instance, in September and October to graze like they do in Central Asia, to grazing these mixed perennial and annual grass areas, most of the time our mother cows are in their late first trimester or early second trimester, which is they're at their lowest. We've weaned, so the lactation period is over. They're in their late first trimester, early second trimester, and so their nutrient demand, if you remember all the way back to the beginning of the class, their nutrient demand is at a low point. And so we're not as worried about having train wrecks and things like that with the need for protein. And if there's anything else out in these areas, and typically in lots of areas there are some kind of shrub, or if there's a green up of some kind, or if there's a forage kochia, something else out there, we don't have to, that they can get for a protein source that cheatgrass may not meet, then we don't have any issues. It's quite interesting, sort of the way that plays out. So it's a very good question. So we're back to this fuel overload. And so what I came up with was this idea of, and this is back in the United States here, this is out at the university or the Agricultural Experiment Station, Gund Ranch. Look at it. I mean, species-wise, it's almost the same, with the exception of crested wheatgrass. We have a little more. This is an old crested wheatgrass seeding that's just dominated by cheatgrass, and there's a lot of sandburg bluegrass in there. So it's very, very similar type of a plant community. What would happen if we managed land in the United States the way they managed land in Central Asia? And conversely, what would happen if we managed land in Central Asia the way that we manage land in the United States? Would we get the same results? The same results being this dominance of cheatgrass across the landscape. And so I came back in 2006 and we initiated a study to try and figure this out about managing land differently. Manage it in the United States by coming back out in an area and cleaning it up in the fall, trying to reduce some of that standing dead biomass, some of that fuel. What would happen? Would we see similar results that we see in Central Asia, and vice versa? If we did it, manage land in Central Asia the way that we manage land in the United States, would we get the same results there as well? So we set out to do this. So we got our cows out there at the gun ranch, and we gave them a job description. We like for our cows to work for us instead of the other way around. And we put them to work. This is what it looks like out there, that matrix in December of 2006. You can see they've eaten sort of holes in that cheatgrass matrix. And we did this. We put these animals out there. We grazed a little bit in the spring as well, but we put these animals out there in the fall, and we let them clean this up just to see if we could reduce the fuel so that we could reduce our wildfire risk. Primarily was our initial sort of approach to this whole thing. Can we reduce the fuels so that if we do get a wildfire, the wildfire won't be quite as severe? And so we did this for 3 consecutive years. We went out and we grazed in the fall for 3 consecutive years with a target of trying to get down to where we're only leaving about 100 to 200 pounds to the acre of forage fuels. That was our target, at 100 to 200 pounds to the acre. We did this for 3 consecutive years. We did it in 2000 with our first grazing session was in fall of 2006. We grazed in 2007. We grazed in 2008. Okay. In the spring of 2009, these were our results. Okay, this is the area that wasn't grazed. This was the control area. So we didn't put any cattle in there at all. And so, I asked the question, do you see any cheatgrass? You shake your heads this way. Yeah, you see cheatgrass, right? It's already starting to turn purple in April here. It's just dominating that entire area. Just dominating it. On the other side of the fence, where we had grazed, the only treatment differences was that we grazed the other side of the fence in the fall for 3 consecutive years to reduce each fall to reduce that fuel down to about 100 to 200 pounds to the acre. Guess what? You look at the next picture there, slide number 15. That was like our Yahoo moment. You have got to be kidding me. Now, this is crested wheatgrass primarily. It's a deep-rooted perennial. It's from Central Asia. There's a lot of sandberg bluegrass in the understory there. There's some needle and thread grass and some stringers back there in the areas. And there is cheatgrass in that picture. There's cheatgrass in that picture in the understory, but it is not the dominant species that you see on the other side of the fence. Go back to the slide before. See how dominant it is here? Look at the fuel characteristic differences between slide number 14 and slide number 15. That's just incredible. All because we grazed it in the fall with cattle for 3 consecutive years and got that fuel load down to about somewhere between 100 and 200 pounds to the acre. Incredible results. Absolutely incredible. We've changed the fuel characteristics. Not only and so there's the same amount of fuel in picture number 14 and in picture number 15. Okay? There's about 500 pounds to the acre of fuel, dry weight fuel in picture number 14. There's about 500 pounds to the acre in picture number 15, dry weight fuel. The same amount of fuel, but we've changed the fuel characteristics. This one in 15, it's greener, the moisture content is higher. It's going to last longer into the fire season before it gets dry. The fuel continuity is different. It's not as contiguous of a fuel load. The plants are scattered out. They're spaced apart, so it's harder to carry a fire once it does senesce and go dry later on in the season. It's going to take a heck of a wind to fuel a fire in this, whereas in picture 14, doesn't take much wind at all, if any, to carry a fire. So we've changed the fuel characteristics just by grazing in the fall with cattle for about 30 to 45 days for the most part. Okay? So, what can grazing do? I don't want you to get too bogged down in the next few slides. I just want to give you an idea of what grazing can do, and think of grazing and surgery. What can grazing do? What can surgery do? Think of it in those in those terms. Okay, um, and grazing affects fire behavior. It affects the fuels. It affects the fire behavior. It'll affect the perimeter, or it can affect the perimeter or the extent of fires. It can affect the patchiness. It can affect the intensity of fire, the heat load. It can affect the flame length of fires, and it can affect the rate of spread. The fuel is the basic energy source for a fire, and if you alter that basic energy source, you can alter fire behavior, and that's what we're after in the long run, is trying to get some fire behavior changes. So the clock says we're done. What we'll do is we'll stop there this morning, and we'll pick up there on Wednesday. Be sure you look at your emails, check your emails. There's an assignment coming. Shoot me a live chat question here if you have one, quick, before we sign off, and we'll talk about this a little bit more on Wednesday. So I'll wait just around a little bit here for some potential question, and and then we'll sign off if nothing shows up. So. Okie doke. До свидания. Still got a few people on here. I'll give it another minute for a question just in case. Okay, до свидания.